Good evening and welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you all here again at the webinar organized by Chennai International Center. Let me hand it over to Rahul Maman, Director of CIC, to invite the panelists and start the session. Over to you, Rahul.
Good evening. On behalf of the Chennai International Center, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you for today's webinar. In the midst of the COVID pandemic, I think one common question we all have is in our minds is when will we be able to return to our pre-COVID lives and enjoy the simple things we took for granted, like going out of our house without fear, like being able to hug our parents without worrying about infecting them. It's these simple things we all miss so much. While many of us sit back and worry about these things, we are very fortunate to have with us today three outstanding individuals who are working tirelessly to give us our pre-COVID lives back. First, we have Dr. J Prakash Mulyan, India's leading epidemiologist. He is a former principal, professor, and head of the Community Health Department at the Christian Medical College, Vellore. He is a member of the National Task Force for COVID-19 Epidemiology and Surveillance. Dr. Mulyan will give us a good perspective on the current progression of the infections in the country, the challenges and strategies to contain the spread, and finally, how and when we can achieve the all-important herd immunity. Thank you, Dr. Mulyan, for joining us today. Next, we have Dr. Anupam Sibal, Group Medical Director at Apollo Hospitals. Professor Sibal established the Division for Pediatric Gastroenterology and Hepatology in Apollo and helped set up the first successful pediatric liver transplant program. Professor Sibal is an author and writes on topics of healthcare. Today, he's here to share with us the journey we have made in developing treatments for COVID-19 and also give us a perspective on what the future could possibly hold in terms of treatment strategies for COVID-19. Thank you, Dr. Sibal, for joining us. Finally, we have Dr. Krishna Ella, Chairman and Managing Director of Bharat Biotech International. I feel every Indian who follows the news today will know about Bharat Biotech. Sir, it is a matter of great pride for all of us to see a company from India amongst the top global pharma companies to develop a potential vaccine for COVID-19. All of us here wish you all the very best in your life-saving endeavor. Thank you very much, Dr. Ella, for joining us. And to moderate this distinguished panel, we have my very good friend Narayan Lakshman, an associate editor at The Hindu. Anybody who has read Narayan's articles will agree with me that he's an outstanding journalist who has a deep perspective on various subjects. I'm sure he will do a great job in moderating the panel today. I would like to thank all the panelists once again for joining us and will now request Narayan to take over.
Thank you, Rahul and Vanita, and thank you to CIC for organizing this most important of webinars at this time, this juncture where we are very much in the midst of this pandemic, and the kind of research that our expert panelists today do every day actually is helping us move towards the point when we will ultimately exit it. So good evening to all of you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, as well, and welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 Endgame scenarios. And I'm very pleased to introduce, as did Rahul with some detail, Dr. Mulyan, Dr. Sibal, and Dr. Ella. Thank you for coming. While the precise time of origin of this novel coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, is still a subject of debate, what is clear is that the broader spread of this viral pathogen outside Wuhan, China began around December 2019, possibly a little bit before. But within a few months, it reached every corner of the globe. As of today, it has infected something close to 19.3 million people worldwide and has resulted in over 718,000 fatalities. India being home to one of the world's largest populations, a large proportion of which is densely crowded and lives in urban and semi-urban areas, has felt the brunt of the impact of COVID-19. And as of today, a little over 2 million people in India have been infected and over 42,000 have succumbed the disease. At the same time, we should not forget that something close to 1.43 million have actually recovered from the disease. While these are the big stylized facts about COVID-19, there's a vast trove of detail about the pandemic that is either less clearly understood or not understood at all. And in some cases, misinformation and even disinformation have a powerful impact on containing the spread of COVID. And so to dispel that, we have to get the facts right, and we have the experts on this panel who will do that today. So as I was saying earlier, we were talking about this. We'll split today's webinar broadly into two categories. Firstly, we'll look at the path that we in India and the world at large have followed since the outbreak of the disease to arrive at the present juncture of the pandemic where we find ourselves today. And second, what could we expect in terms of future developments that will eventually see us exiting the pandemic, likely on the back of a successful vaccine? So we'll look into that as well. And to map out that complex terrain, I now invite the three experts we have to share their comments. And I'd like to begin by requesting Dr. Mulyan to consider the following questions on the epidemiology of COVID-19 and share his insights. Firstly, in terms of getting a grip on the pandemic. So could you tell us, please, how do you feel from an epidemiology perspective, how fast this pandemic has spread in India relative to what it has, say, in other countries? And similarly, has the sheer speed led to a certain sense of paranoia almost? And could you dispel some of the wrong ideas that are floating about in that case? That is the first part. Secondly, could you also look at testing and the question of surveillance and monitoring? Is it really stretching the capacity of states? Is there a shortage of kits originally cited? Is that still a problem? Have we overcome that? And looking to the forward situation, could you talk about when a vaccine is made available at some time, assuming it is safe and effective, will it actually stop the epidemic in its tracks, or will it take longer to acquire herd immunity and to bring the infection rates down? And further looking at the vaccine, could you talk about its distribution design that would maximize the impact that it would have in terms of which demographics should be targeted? Should it be the healthcare workers? Should it be older persons? And finally, if you could just look at the state capacity to meet such pandemic needs in the sense of what public health infrastructure should governments be investing, particularly in India, in the future, hypothetically, if such a pandemic comes back again. So quite a large number of questions, but I think you could feel free to address them in any order that you'd like. The floor is yours, Dr. Mulyan. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Narayan. Thank you so very much. As Mr. Narayan said, I am an epidemiologist, but my early life was almost a rural doctor, and all my early days spent taking care of children with measles, whooping cough, and pneumonias. My main interest was leprosy. Somehow I migrated into epidemiology, and I've been teaching it ever since. Difference between a clinician and an epidemiologist lies in this particular point. Clinicians think of all possibilities, but epidemiologists mainly look at probabilities and pick on the most likely probability in creating a story. So you may find that I don't dwell on outliers and strange phenomena. For example, when this virus first came in, we had the information there is something happening in China, but Chinese assured us that there was no person-to-person transmission. That is a big relief. Later it turned out it was not correct information. So like Mr. Narayan said, the story of COVID has been a journey from the beginning of incorrect information, probably misinformation, and trying to tease them off together is not quite easy. Now, this is not the first epidemic we have had. We know of many viral diseases, and many other viral diseases are even more dangerous. So whenever a new disease comes, we ask just three questions. A, how efficient is it in transmitting itself? And number two, is it dangerous? What is the mortality like? And the third important question is, does it give you immunity after one attack? And you look for evidence in all these things. This particular virus came with a peculiar ability. In a large number of cases, it was subclinical. And even as a subclinical case or a subclinical infection, it could infect others. That brought us to our knees practically because it was so difficult to contain it. And today, after a long journey, we understand containment of virus by force is not at all possible. Today, we know that the only way to prevent lies in each individual's hand. Prevention comes from individual effort. So the recipe for it, everybody knows. Lockdowns, I don't believe helped. And all this isolation or quarantine doesn't help. It is just because the virus is so efficient as a subclinical, infector. Now, I said this to begin with because everything else, when I'm going to say, depends on this one important issue. The second thing I want to remember is the mortality. It was frightening in the beginning to see rumors and things like that as a high mortality disease. Now we have much better handle on the mortality. The mortality among under 15 is very, very, very low. I don't give you numbers, but it is really, really low. Now, for example, I'll tell you, we have about 36 crore people under the age of 15. And you know how many children die every year in that age group? 2 million. What will COVID add to it? Oh, maybe 300. At all. So it is not a child killer, which is the greatest relief as far as I'm concerned. And I know most people understand that this is the truth. The problem is it affects elderly above the age of 55 or 60, and you have to be cautious about it. So this is the two important things. And the third issue was, does it produce good immunity? And initially we were told no. That is quite a surprise because viral epidemics usually give you good immunity. Now we know immunity is good, very good and lasting. And you know, since I'm convinced about it, not by looking at the data of the epidemic, but by the good studies that have come out from some reputed institutions in the world, and that it gives you neutralizing antibodies, T-cell mediated support. So we believe if a person is infected and comes out okay, then comes that you can be fairly certain that will be a long-lasting immunity. And the point I keep saying this is the reason I also believe a vaccine that we produce will be a good one. Why? A very immunogenic virus also lends itself to making a very good immunogenic vaccine. Remember, both these things work the same way. The wild virus, tickles your immunity and provokes you to immune response. Vaccine also does the same thing. But the difference is very fundamental. In vaccine, we expect zero mortality. In this case, however, we have to suffer mortality. So, to begin with, getting disease is not the way to acquire immunity, right? Yes, but did we have an option? No. I told you from the beginning, containment was theoretically impossible in Indian situation. Why is that? The type of containment measures you need are so gruesome. A family will be locked into a house continuously for several weeks. Is it thinkable that you can't go out for anything, not even to buy a vegetable, and you stay inside? That is the kind of hard lockdown you need. That would have really created a revolt. That is the reason this is not. So the question is, did the epidemic grow too fast, too slow? Well, in my opinion, we were expecting an exponential rise, and it did go exponentially. How do I know that? Now, you remember about the time when India had 1 million cases. Delhi Sero Survey report came. Do you know what that report meant? That at least in Delhi alone, 5 million people have been infected, cleared, they're immune, they walked home. So, how did that happen? Because we can't contain the disease with your isolation and quarantine and things like that. The way we can do is because if you're cautious, if you sit and protect yourself, mask, and never avoid crowd. If you look at Chennai, you will find different levels of protection now they are acquiring. Some area, it is high because they have been infected. Some area low because the infection is low. Now comes this word called herd immunity. Herd immunity is a very strange phenomenon, difficult people to understand. It means that when you acquire the infection, you get immunity. You are protected for a fairly long time. But herd immunity goes a step further. When about half the population, I'm using half as a number for the convenience, then the other half also get protected. Now, how can this happen? This is interesting because this particular disease travels from person to person. And in that travel, when you put blocks in the form of resistant individual, immune individual, then the virus transmission dramatically changes. And we get to a stage where the immunity dwindles down and come down so that the case load also come down dramatically. Now, if you look at the containment areas in places like Mumbai, where you had a high rate earlier, their level of new case formation has reduced remarkably. They come to single digits instead of hundreds. You understand? And if you look at the immunology, about 56% have been infected. So it looks like this particular herd immunity refers to a particular threshold at which the transmission dynamics is seriously affected and the number of cases emerging comes to very low numbers. It doesn't mean the virus is gone. What it means is that the epidemic has stopped. At least gives us a breather. At least if every city, big city, goes down this way and reaches herd immunity quickly, you will find that it is less frightening. Remember, the whole process of this transmission and the control measure have put a fear of God in everybody's mind. Even people who have finished their infection come home, they have been told you will get infected again in 3 months. Not fair. Very unfair in my opinion. There are others who disagree with me. I don't mind that. But I'm confident this is a lasting immunity because that I also believe the vaccine will do a good job. Right. Now one question. When will this end? And everybody asks me. India has a unique distinction of all the cities showing extremely high IgG level. That is the test they've done. And this means that we are approaching the point of herd immunity earlier. So I am confident that this time will come very soon. Now remember, even at the end of the epidemic, about 50% of the population of India is still susceptible and will require vaccine for future protection of the individual. That's a different story. But I look forward to the day when we can take the whole epidemic control, give it back to the health system, not just the government health system, private and government, because traditionally 80% of the sickness, pneumonia, were being looked up by the private sector. They have been actually paralyzed of late. Now, we would like the civil administration to take a break after this epidemic in all the cities come down and leave it to the doctors, nurses, and technicians to look after people who suffer from disease. The major drama that has been going on in cities is over. So we would be soon relieved of this tension, anxiety, suspicion, and above all, stigma. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mulyan. That was deeply insightful, and I'm sure we have some questions to come back to you with as we digest this very insightful comments you just made. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Sybil to please give us an in-depth insight similarly into the complex and dynamically evolving question of COVID-19 therapeutics. Specifically, sir, would you consider the rapid advancements and tell us about how prepared were India's therapeutic system to handle the acceleration in the number of incoming patients originally? Please look at issues such as diagnostics, inpatient care, ICU care, protocols, infection control, and even managing teams, because all of this gets extremely complex in the high pressure situation that COVID-19 brought upon us. And secondly, could you also look at maybe some of the misconceptions in terms of therapeutics? You could touch upon, for example, non-allopathic treatments, or on the flip side, you could look at the efficacy and importance of basic, social distancing, hand washing, and so forth that even Dr. Mulyan alluded to. And finally, could you also, in terms of sort of allopathic therapies, clarify on issues such as hydroxychloroquine, its efficacy or not, plasma therapy, the role of steroids in mitigating the cytokine storm, and all of those other issues that have come up in the course of what you have seen in your therapeutics journey so far. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Very good evening to all the members of the Chennai International Center and colleagues from all of the country who've joined. I want to thank everyone for this opportunity. Thank you, Narayan, for that introduction to the topic, and of course your long list of questions, which I will try my best to answer. Within the first 3 weeks of the first case being diagnosed in Wuhan, it became clear that we needed to brace up for something we hadn't seen. The last pandemic that everyone had seen was the swine flu pandemic, but that wasn't at this level. And anyone who had any experience with the Spanish flu had to be at least 100 years or more. So basically, we were going to have to deal with something that we'd not seen. So on one side, we had the pandemic, but on the other side, we also had the infodemic, because the kind of world we live in with the easy exchange of information and this became pretty evident in the first few days that we were going to have an information explosion. So we as healthcare providers needed to look at the pandemic and the infodemic. So if we just touch on the pandemic, as of today, we have 19.5 million cases, 724,000 deaths sadly. So this is huge, unprecedented. If we look at the infodemic, that I think is really interesting. Now, if you go on to Google and type COVID-19, you will get 6.9 billion results. 6.9 billion results. Try typing diabetes, you get 467 million results. And diabetes was first described in 1500 BC. And the first case of COVID-19 was described or diagnosed exactly 220 days ago. So in 222 days, we have 14 times more information on COVID-19 than we have for diabetes, which was described in 1500 BC. There are about 50 million WhatsApp messages that get transmitted every minute. And there was a time when about half of them were related to COVID. Now let's look at medical literature. If you go to PubMed, and that's where we go to look for peer-reviewed published papers, COVID-19, as of today, 38,523 published papers. If you look at COVID-19 and treatment alone, there are 13,890 papers. COVID in India, 2,015 papers. COVID in India, treatment, 745 papers. So in 222 days, we have 38,523 papers, which translates to 173 peer-reviewed papers published every day, 7.2 papers per hour. By the time this panel discussion finishes, I will have to read 10.5 papers to keep myself abreast of what has happened. So, the infodemic is huge. And if the average citizen who's not medical reads all that is actually dished out to him or her, it is very likely that they will panic. There will be a lot of anxiety and there would be a lot of worry. So we decided to focus on the twin challenges. So we launched at Apollo what is known as Project Quach. A lot of healthcare providers, small hospitals, nursing homes, eventually had to do that because while the focus initially was on the government hospitals, then it became corporate hospitals, and then all hospitals in areas where there was a lot of COVID were enlisted to manage patients. So as part of the Project Quach, we looked at the population at large on one level, and then we looked at patients on the other level. So we look at the population level, we developed a 24/7 helpline because we were getting a lot of questions. We also developed a corona risk scan, which was a self-assessment scan because people were panicking. Do you think I'm likely to get COVID or not? And we had 18 million people take this risk scan. We developed a 24/7 consultation because people were panicking and their follow-up visits suddenly came to a standstill, and we needed to develop virtual consults. We also needed to develop virtual consults for dietetics, for physiotherapy. People who were on regular medication needed help to get medication. So we decided at-home medication out of our 3,800 pharmacies. People didn't want to come out for their blood tests. So we needed to enhance ability to take blood samples at home. We developed Stay Eye because everybody who had symptoms needed come into a hospital, but they couldn't really isolate themselves at home. So we developed Stay Eye program, which was in hotels, different levels, where there would be a nurse, there would be a virtual consult, and we would monitor, and if using our protocols, and if there was need, we would get them into the hospital. And we constantly gave out information that was updated all the time, and that helped us reach out to 18 million people. Now, moving on to the patient. So we had to get the clinicians, the hospital, the administrators, the nurses, everyone together and ready. So we looked at a team approach. So we formed separate teams pan-India. We were a very large network, 73 hospitals across 16 states of India. So we got the clinical teams together on what are the protocols for treatment. We got the lab teams together on how we're going to start diagnosing. Remember that there was no ability to diagnose this condition in January. There was just one government-approved lab. So it was about building capacity to be able to test. Then we needed to look at ventilation capacity, sort of training our folks, the junior doctors. We have a lot of trainees, 3-year training program. We needed to make sure that their knowledge on ventilation, ICU care was enhanced. So we launched courses. We also started a ventilation training a module, including simulation, which we developed with the Boston Children's Hospital rather quickly. We got all the administrators together. How do we ramp up? How do we keep the staff motivated? How do we get the senior people on the floors all the time to motivate staff? How do we get the nurses energized? How do we empower them? How do we instill confidence in them that it's going to be okay? And this is a huge responsibility that you have to shoulder. You remember that in India, the vast majority of nurses are very young. And remember that for junior doctors also, this was their first brush with something of this nature that can be so serious. We started looking at infection control. So we had infection control teams everywhere, multi-specialty, including nurses, administrators, engineers, everyone, look at protocols that we needed to pilot and then perfect and then get them across the group. And we also got a data analytic team. together to start looking at data crunching. How is it that we can use machine learning and arrive at algorithms that will help us, prognosticate when a patient comes in, and how is it that we can guide therapy. We scaled up in testing from 0 to 5 to 11 to now we have 18 centers that can test, and this testing includes what is the gold standard, which is RT-PCR or CB-NAT. We also developed capability in several of our labs for antigen testing, which was sort of allowed by ICMR about 6 weeks ago. Then serology was also allowed, and every state has their rules. Sometimes within states, different districts have their rules. So we've actually spent a lot of time every morning looking at what is the advisory that applies to us. And honestly, there've been more than 150 advisories. So there's been a fair amount of time navigating the advisories and making sure that we are right up there when it comes to testing or in terms of admissions, because there were lots of flexibility. You could test only inpatients, or you could test only outpatients and inpatients, but you couldn't test at home. You could only treat an X number. What was the facility capability to be able to handle? And all this varied from district to district, administration to administration. We needed to make sure that we have rooms that meet the requirement for such a condition. So we scaled up from 1 to 50 to 250 pretty quickly, then 1,200 beds, 2,000 beds, 2,500 beds. So as of now, we have the ability to manage 2,500 COVID-19 patients and provide state-of-the-art care to them. We needed to make sure that we have enough PPEs. And actually, a fair amount of procurement happened early Feb. So we knew that this is really going to be huge. So we bought enough PPEs. So we never had any shortage of any N95s or any of the other PPEs that we need. We developed what we refer to as the Red Book, and we have the 9th version. So that's really a 170-page book that comes out and gets revised from time to time, that talks about every single touch point, the role of everyone, from the CEO down to the ward staff, to the nurses, to the security, housekeeping, on how they have to handle when a patient walks in, when the patient goes from one part of the hospital to another, investigations, radiology, discharge, and so on. And then we started focusing through the clinical team on the clinical protocols. We are now on the 24th version of our clinical protocol. We revise it every Friday or Saturday, and sometimes we have to go in and revise it even more than once a week if we get really important information that's going to have a huge impact on how we manage patients. We also realized that in India, we were lucky that we would have a few weeks compared to our counterparts in Europe and America. And perhaps you're aware that there are 1.4 million physicians of Indian origin in the world. So Global Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, GAPIO, a society formed by Dr. Reddy, our chairman, has been around for 10 years. And we launched the Global Indian Physician COVID-19 Collaborative. So we got physicians from different countries, more than 55 countries, to come on one platform. And in fact, just as we finish this meeting today, we have another of the global collaborative sessions on demystifying diagnosis. So we got experts from all over the world to guide us on what they were seeing. And of course, we had Indian experience, which was mounting. And there was an exchange of ideas on how is it that we can quickly improve the way we are managing patients and get the best of learnings, whatever's been published, whatever people have experienced, and bring it into our system. We also started looking at trials because, all the drugs virtually are under a trial. So we started off with hydrochloroquine, and of course, a lot has been talked about it, and I will touch on that. Then there is the WHO Solidarity trial that has several arms, of course. Some arms have been stopped, but remdesivir was a part of this arm. Then we had IL-6 drugs, so we have tocilizumab, and there's a trial with that. Then plasma therapy, because it is still experimental, so we enrolled and created a multi-centric plasma therapy trial. And then there are 3 more other trials that we've been looking at. We had to spend a fair amount of time motivating our staff because, they too, because of the infodemic, really were worried. I mean, it's not easy to be in PPEs for several hours, not being able to take a bio break, not being able to drink water, eat food. And it's really hard when you can't go back home as part of the protocol in terms of you're looking after COVID patients. And also when you go back after your duty is over, you're very worried if you're going to actually take the bug home and actually, pass it on to your family members, and if you have elderly parents or grandparents. So, there was a fair amount of motivation that was needed, and we invested on that. Now, coming to some of the questions that you asked about therapy. So, as you know, there are no specific drugs for COVID-19. These are repurposed drugs that we have known for a while. Some of them we've known for decades, like hydrochloroquine for malaria. We've used that extensively for rheumatoid arthritis. So repurposing of drugs started relatively early. And of course, hydrochloroquine has been talked about a lot. Mr. Trump talked about it, started making headlines. And if you ask me, if you look at all the data that has come out, and there's so much controversy, and you as a journalist would know, Narayan, about the number of editorials that have come out on hydrochloroquine. But from random utilization or use or prescription of drugs, we have to move to randomized controlled trials. Now, we are 222 days into this disease, so you can't randomly prescribe something. There is data available, and this is based through RCTs, which are randomized controlled trials. And for those who don't understand trials, which means that someone will get the medication and someone with exactly the same inclusion criteria will not get the medication, and then you will look at the outcomes. That's really the only way of finding out whether a drug A works or not. Now, for hydrochloroquine, we don't have any evidence that it actually works. Of course, there is a group of clinicians who believe that hydrochloroquine went into disrepute because of side effects that everybody knows about, because the doses that were used for hydrochloroquine were at a very high level. So in some ways, the design of the trial, according to some experts, was that the amount of drug that we were giving was so in such a high dose that the toxicity was likely, and we had no experience using those doses. And therefore, the toxicity potential and the side effects led hydrochloroquine getting into disrepute. So this is where we stand with hydrochloroquine. Hydrochloroquine for prophylaxis, ICMR has been supporting its use, and there is some data to support its use that yes, when used prophylactically in healthcare workers, it has been helpful. But again, many people believe that there isn't enough data to support the use of hydrochloroquine even as a prophylactic. Then comes remdesivir. Huge amount of talk about remdesivir, miracle molecule. Again, a lot of stuff happened that generated a lot of interest. There were some initial trials that weren't very impressive, and then we got some data from the US that there was a decrease in the length of stay by 4 days when you use remdesivir. There was some data to suggest that whether you used it for 5 days or for 10 days didn't really matter, and 5 days was good enough. Then there was some data to suggest that it improves the chances of recovery if you're on remdesivir, and now there's interest in using remdesivir not as an IV, because currently it's given intravenously, but perhaps as an inhaled approach. Then the really exciting stuff that came was with the recovery trial in the United Kingdom. And I remember when the data started coming out, that night we sat and changed our protocol and brought dexamethasone or steroids. It became very clear with steroids that you can actually improve outcomes in those where they're having respiratory difficulties and where oxygenation is getting compromised and you need to intervene. It was clearly shown that steroids make a difference. And this was a very well conducted trial on a very large scale in the United Kingdom. And we were so excited because, we are all very familiar with the use of steroids. It's very cheap. We've used it for decades and decades for a variety of conditions. So we changed our protocol overnight the day we got the data and introduced steroids into our protocol. Then there's this thing about the cytokine storm that everybody's read about. What happens at a particular time during the course of COVID-19, say around day 7, is that there is a huge release of cytokines. And this results in a cytokine storm, which has major manifestations across systems in the body. And if we can give an IL-6 antagonist, perhaps that would stem that. So there are 3 molecules that have been looked at that actually work on the cytokine storm. But then data that was just released last week on use of IL-6 showed that it actually did not change outcomes. And there is now one trial that is actually looking at remdesivir along with tocilizumab. There is also the talk of looking at remdesivir with retrovirals like Rito and Lipo. There is also interest in combining tocilizumab with other drugs. Then, of course, what we also heard from different parts of the world, ivermectin, a drug which everybody's used for, it's effective against, it's anti-protozoal, so against worms, and it's being used in Bangladesh along with doxycycline, but there isn't compelling data. But then it's a cheap drug, it's easy to administer, it's an oral drug. So we also have to look at the ease of administering a particular drug. And then the amount of time that has been spent on plasma is truly remarkable. Now, what does plasma therapy do? Basically, you get COVID, you get the SARS-CoV-2 virus, your body mounts an immune response, you will develop antibodies. Those antibodies will stay, and as Dr. J Prakash talked about IgG, you will initially get IgM, then the IgM will wane, you will get IgG antibodies, and that's really how the immune system works. Now, if you take plasma from someone who's recovered, and you do that a few weeks after there's been recovery, you will have antibodies in the plasma. And if you transfuse that plasma into someone who has COVID, theoretically, there should be benefit. Now, what could the benefit be? Maybe these antibodies will prevent the binding of the virus to the cell. Maybe they will prevent the virus replication, and maybe they will have some anti-inflammatory effects as well. Now we know, and this is based on data of about 20,000 plasma infusions in the United States, that it's safe. Now that's really important because plasma therapy is safe, we know that, and 20,000 is a huge number. Now, how effective is it? Some of the randomized controlled trials have now been completed, and we are awaiting the results. And it might as well be that plasma therapy is found to be very effective. We, for example, at Apollo, have just completed a multi-center trial on 100 patients looking at plasma therapy. What, if you ask me, discussing with clinicians, the blood bank experts, we believe that the plasma therapy role will evolve. Perhaps we are using it at a stage where a lot of damage has happened, and perhaps we can use it at an earlier stage. And if we were to use it at an earlier stage, perhaps the impact would be different. And when we're talking about an early stage, perhaps it could even be used as an outpatient, because you come in, you have your infusion, and you go home. So I think the plasma therapy therapeutic option, I think, is very interesting. It's something that we're going to talk more and more about. Then another interesting molecule is the monoclonal. Yeah. Sorry. I'm going to finish. Okay. You want to talk about which is again that has been talked about in the last week, which is the monoclonal antibodies. So monoclonal antibodies will work just like plasma therapy. They're also antibodies. So I think to summarize, there are 1,039 potential therapies, 1,039 potential therapies, and there are 2,737 clinical trials going on. So I think we are searching for the magic bullet, and I'm pretty sure we will find it. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sibbal. That was very comprehensive, and again, lots of information for us to digest. Let me, at this point, bring in Dr. Ella to share with us his thoughts on the vaccine race, which is in fact more like a high-speed marathon, and we are sort of somewhere in the middle stretch. Dr. Ella, please consider the following. Could you tell us a bit about what were the initial sort of pressures and incentives to jump into this vaccine race, especially Covaxin as an Indian sort of made in India kind of product, of course, with collaboration with other entities outside. Sort of how did that kick off, and how did you jump into this very complex and competitive race, to be honest? And secondly, could you tell us a bit of the details on the different vaccine trials, the phases, and how you actually strike that balance between safety and effectiveness of the vaccine? Obviously, a big question for everyone, especially as we get to a point where it comes to market. And finally, could you just give us details about anything you can share about how the vaccine under research at the moment works in terms of destroying the novel coronavirus, sort of the biology of it? Thank you.
Thank you, Narayan. Honored to be there. I'm right actually from near Chennai. Tiruthan is a small village from Tiruthan is my native place. And I studied Hindu high school, Triplicane. And then, of course, then moved out to agriculture and then to US. Just want to say very few things. Indian vaccine industry, nothing less than a multinationals of Europe or US. That I want to be clear. And we are, as a vaccine manufacturers, Indian vaccine manufacturers, whether us or Serum or other companies, far ahead of Chinese in terms of technology, in terms of clinical research, and all of them were extremely good. We are nowhere less than GSK or Sanofi globally. So I want to be very clear on that matter, because many people have got skepticism whether Indian company can do it or not. That's very clear first. And we have developed ourselves a typhoid conjugate first time in the world. And we developed, Rotavirus, all the clinical trials, CMC, Velu to KEM, AIMS, all of them places. And we're doing typhoid conjugate, 8 different countries clinical trial. So we have tremendous experience in manufacturing and also the clinical trial aspect of it. So we have done more than 6 lakhs babies of clinical trial. So we have pretty good experience. So don't think that Indian companies cannot do like a GSK and Sanofi. That I want to clear that mind. But I've been telling this, as Dr. J Prakash said very clearly, the pandemic is one of the strategy. Why are we getting attention of pandemic? It is not the death that is causing a problem. It is the economy that is destroyed. What is getting attention to this virus? Nothing much. The economy is destroyed. So everybody now, every politician, every bureaucrat is talking about it is only because of economies got destroyed. But this pandemic was there all the time. We have accidents, more death than even COVID right now. So, but the problem is, I've been telling to government for the last 17 years, we need to work on a developing neglected disease of the developing world. Because most of the developing world has got a neglected diseases. And all the neglected diseases turn out to be pandemic in the future. And that is what happened chikungunya, and what happened Zika, what happened pandemic flu, yellow fever, tuberculosis. Every disease you look at it, it all started from the developing world, from China, India, or Africa, all developing world. And it started from there, it went to other part of the world. So it's not the US and Europe likes India or anybody just because we want to work on neglected. They're also scared because we don't work on neglected, it may become a global disease. That's the reason why everybody says now we need to work on neglected. And all neglected turn out to be pandemic as we go along. And when we worked in 2006 chikungunya, everybody said it's not important disease. Now the global is now recognizing that chikungunya is important and other diseases also important. So as you said, the vaccine experience, there's a tremendous pressure on us. Somebody wants us to manufacture today and give the vaccine tomorrow. That doesn't happen. So we want to have the safety is the most important. You don't want to kill more people by having a wrong vaccine into the field. That's much more dangerous, much more unethical. So even if it delays, let it come. Many people question how fast we can do the clinical trial. It also depends on what type of time frame you have. Like, for example, rotavirus vaccine. It takes 6 months, one phase to complete. Whereas this one, pandemic Covaxin type of thing, is only 30 days, one phase trial. You inject, 14 days sample, give one more dose, 28th day, draw the blood, you're done 30 days. And then analysis takes another 10, 15 days of neutralization assays. So that's very fast. It depends on a virus, how fast you can go clinical trial. But the process is in India, the sequence was not announced by China very early. Only January 10th they announced the sequence, although they know the sequence much before that. But they announced it strategically late. But US, in 42 days, it went to clinical trial. It got delayed in India because of a process. The process of the missionaries in the system is how can an Indian company can do? Only American company has to do it first, and then we have to follow that. So that mindset has to change in this country. If it changes, we are nowhere inferior. We can fast track. So we're working on different platforms. People are working in inactivated vaccine is one of the strategy. Inactivated means grow the virus and kill them. And just is a old traditional. I believe in old is gold still. And we've made 6, 7 different vaccines killing the vaccine. The problem is it's not very highly immunogenic, but it's best for any pregnant lady to babies or even immunocompromised patients. There's another platform. People are talking about spike protein. Everybody's talking spike protein. Okay, that's a target. Spike protein can be made as a subunit vaccine or just recombinantly, or otherwise you can make a DNA responsible for spike or RNA responsible for spike protein. That's what the people are talking about, different platform. Another one is vector-based vaccine, chimpanzee adeno. People are saying, can you put a spike protein, RNA or DNA into adenovirus and then deliver it to the person? Because adeno is one of the respiratory pathogen and so easier to deliver through that. Can we deliver? but we are seeing a differences in that immunogenicity. So I think it's wonderful to have various platform technology in the globally and see what happens. So we need to give 1.3 billion population of India. So it's not going to be injectable vaccine alone. So you can't give injectable to all the 1.3 billion. If it all resurface this virus again next year, we can't give 1.3 billion. But certainly we need a different way of strategy and public health system. And we're looking at that. And I leave it, the time is a constraint, and leave it Narayan to take forward. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ella. And I think all of you have also already touched upon a few forward-looking comments. But let me push that envelope a bit further. Starting with you, Dr. Mulyan, you have, as an esteemed epidemiologist who's also worked extensively with government and public policy, have an insider view of how sufficient the system is in terms of the capacity of public health infrastructure to meet this pandemic as well as any hypothetical future pandemic. Could you talk to us a bit more about what more sort of build-up of that capacity is needed, of institutions, of research, of literally the design of those, those aspects of institutions that bring vaccines to the population, that help to break down a pandemic and understand the virus at the heart of it. How much more work does India need to do in particular to meet this pandemic's challenges and the one of the future, if it ever happens?
In general, the opinion of the Indian public health system is never been very, complimentary, and people look at it suspiciously. Part of the reason is not because it's bad everywhere. It's extremely good in certain parts of the country and extremely poor in certain other parts of the country. So the stark difference makes it a little more disconcerting. I know our health capacity to take care of sick people in the public health domain is limited, and private healthcare has a major share in that. However, when it comes to vaccine delivery, the track record of Indian public health has been outstanding. So we have the record of having done remarkably large amount of work and pretty efficiently under polio, under control of measles and rubella. These track records are quite excellent. The strategy that how do you deliver this thing has to be worked out scientifically. It's not that here is a vaccine, everybody take it. That is not going to be the formula. Remember, the disease has to be addressed according to the way it is affecting people, and to think about it, strategize, and use a vaccine. And I'm especially happy that our companies have a good track record of delivering vaccine, and also their commitment to give safe vaccine. That is important. So from Indian context, once we have a vaccine, we should be able to deliver effectively. Our systems are good enough.
Thank you. And a question to Dr. Sibal. Sir, again, looking forward at what further is needed in the realm of therapeutics, we have seen a diversity of symptoms, anything from, blood clotting related conditions to even some reports coming now and then of diabetes emerging in certain patients to, of course, long-term lung damage, psychological effects, of course, from the trauma. So what are the future therapeutic tools and future therapeutic approaches that you anticipate you'll have to follow going forward in the months ahead until we have this option to exit the pandemic?
Right. I think our understanding of the pathogenesis of COVID-19, what the SARS-CoV-2 virus does in the human body, is improved considerably. See, when it first started, we thought it behaved like the flu virus, so you'll get flu-like symptoms. And there were also comparisons with MERS and SARS because of the similarity. But clearly, this was not the case, and it became evident in a few days that this virus behaves differently. So, you have a situation where you have the early stage flu-like symptoms, and then you get pulmonary inflammation. And what became evident pretty quickly was the coagulopathy. And what happens then is you have huge amount of inflammatory biomarkers that get released, whether it's CRP, ferritin, IL-6, IL-1, B dimers, and then you can develop adult respiratory distress syndrome. And then you have the third stage finally, which is the fibrosis, where you've recovered, but you come back and your lungs really have been replaced by fibrous tissue. It also became clear as time went by that there are two respiratory phenotypes. You have the L type and the H type, and in the H type you have pulmonary edema, which makes it very hard to ventilate. So while the focus initially was on ventilation, now the focus is in how can you keep someone off the ventilator. And the idea is to do everything in your power to prevent an intubation and invasive ventilation. So you use high flow oxygen, you do whatever you can, but you try and avoid ventilation. And I think that's really the focus. So there's a huge enhancement of our knowledge and how things were being looked at to how things are being looked at today. We have a classification system of what is mild, what is moderate, what is severe, what is critical, what needs to be triggered as you get into a particular stage, what investigations do you have to do, how do you have to monitor, which treatment modalities come in. What we are searching out for is a molecule that's oral, very important, because you would want something that can be administered orally. You want something that is effective, obviously. You want something that has virtually no side effects. I'm saying virtually because it's hard to find something that has no side effects. You want it to be easily accessible, and you want it to be cheap. So that's really our ask: oral, effective, cheap, easily accessible with no side effects. Now that's obviously hard. It takes time to be able to develop such a drug. So we're moving and in hopefully in that direction by identifying something. But clearly, with the availability of steroids, the use of steroids, the use of anti-clotting medication, whether it's heparin or other measures which are being used very effectively, the use of remdesivir in selected patients, the use of IL agents in selected cases, the use of plasma therapy in selected cases, I think has really given us a huge amount of options that we didn't have. And I'm very encouraged because if you look at how we've treated this, within a few days, we unraveled the genome. Within a few days, we identified the diagnostics. Within a few weeks, the trials were designed, the repurposed drugs, the trials started. Protocols, as I mentioned, have repeatedly become better. The trials have been fast-tracked so that we get data quickly. On vaccines, as Dr. Krishna talked about, the identification of what are the potential vaccine candidates, and you have 127 of them with 7 human trials, and in fact, 3 already in phase 3 trials. So I think the pace at which we've worked, how we've used transcontinental collaborations, how we used ML, AI, modeling, I think gives a lot of hope that, while on one side we'll have the vaccine, on the other side, we will hopefully have a therapeutic agent which is better. And while we develop such a therapeutic agent, by the judicious application of the therapeutic agents available to us, we will improve outcomes. And I just want to mention here, and this is very important, and again, a sense of pride in India, like we have with Dr. Krishna's work in vaccinology, is that the case fatality rates in Italy was 15%. And in India, 2%. And I think that is huge. And that just shows on how well we've adapted to the challenges, how we've ramped up, how good our protocols are, and how we have been able to get our arms around a condition which was really hard to actually manage. And the challenges seemed huge when we first started.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sibal. And just the final few minutes, Dr. Ella, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the vaccine. There are lots of questions around it in terms of effectiveness and safety. Of course, that is the focus for your own research. But beyond that, how ideally should it be distributed? Should it go to healthcare workers first, older people, people with comorbidities? Will its performance be uniform, or will it vary across different cohorts? And how long will it last? Do you need booster shots? Could you just explain the features of the vaccine, as well as more in terms of when you think realistically it will be brought to market?
One thing is very clear now, finally with a little immunology, that cell-mediated immune response is very critical for this virus. That's a little bit understood now. So how do you get cell-mediated responses? So how do you make it? Is it better to have a nasal drop that can give mucosal immunity and delivery system can be easier? That's going to be challenging. In case if it resurface the country's economy, again, back next year, we hope not, but if it happens, then can we give 1.2 billion population with a nasal drop or something like that is one of the strategy. And adjuvant is one of the strategy. But certainly who has to be taken, you look at the China and India. China is given to all the army people first. So they vaccinated entire 5 million people are vaccinated with their vaccine already, which is not very effective vaccine. It's not even 30%, 40% of effectiveness of the vaccine, adenovirus 5, 85. 85 will not work in India because most of us, or 80% of the people are exposed to the adenovirus earlier. And that adeno pre-existing immunity, if you give the vaccine, it may not work also. Okay, but they have done it, Chinese. But I think in the Indian context, most important for us is the healthcare workers, police, defense people, and the fourth is certainly the elder people above 65 or 60 or 65, because we don't live longer in this country. So above 60, I'm part of that 60. So above 60 definitely needed this vaccine, where you don't want them to have any of the adverse reaction. Young people, as Dr. J Prakash said, young people are not getting the virus. That's a good sign for us. And so it's the productive citizens are safe in a way. But now the unproductive citizen, about 60 years old people, so they definitely need this vaccine, and the pregnant ladies and all those people are required. And that would be the first target to me if I look at it.
And with that, we will move on to taking questions from the audience, and there are quite a few already. So I'll start with one question to you, Dr. Ella. This relates to a question around the pricing of the vaccine. In the intense race to find the vaccine, there have been reports that no developing country could possibly afford it. That's one possible scenario. Is there any scope for free supply, as in the case of polio? And related to that, there's a question around what's called vaccine protectionism, based on nationalist sentiments. If some companies try to get IPR protection, how could it lead to a more equitable distribution of the vaccine across the world?
As I said in the beginning, the vaccine industry, like us, are not far behind the multinationals. So we are well prepared on intellectual properties. So rest assured that intellectual properties are well taken by the Indian companies. We are far ahead of it. That is taking care of it. We know that this will hurt us, the world trade economy, when you have trade barrier will come in if you are violating. And China is facing the problem with US right now on that intellectual property issue. So I think we are far ahead of that issues. And what we do is we partner with some of the academic institutes in US, whether Thomas Jefferson, University of Wisconsin, or Washington University, St. Louis. We partner with them on intellectual properties so that we don't violate any of the intellectual property. That is taking care of it. Coming to your second question, Narayan, how do you cost? The cost, I'll tell you honestly, I've been telling the rotavirus vaccine, $85. GSK and Merck sells at $85. And we offered to, when the Gates Foundation gave us a $200 million grant, we said we'll deliver it at $1 dose vaccine. Nobody believed me. Everybody criticized. Even press has criticized me. I think he's going to give a water in the not the vaccine. People talked about it. But I want to mention that the vaccine quality, whether Merck or GSK or Bharat Biotech, same quality. Trust me on this one. Same quality, same efficacy, parameters, all are same. We follow the US FDA and follow the WHO TRS guidelines. All of them same. The quality is same. And we have done efficacy trial also according to the multinationals requirement, according to the international requirement. So don't be assured. You can be rest assured. If India cannot manufacture the vaccine at an affordable, nobody else in the world can manufacture. That be rest assured on that. And even pharma drugs, we are the lowest in the world. In spite of that, government of India puts a price restriction. And it doesn't make sense to me. And we are the lowest in the world, but still price restriction is there. But I think Indian, in general, the vaccine manufacturer, for example, the Covaxin, I never took money from the government of India. I said, it's my time as an industrial person, a scientist. to pay back to the country. Why do you want to exploit the government to take the money at this time? I don't want to do it. I didn't take it any money. I said I will do it myself, my own investment, and do it for the giving back to the country. I think we are not interested in this profit in this kind of project. We don't want economy to go get destroyed. That is our only goal for us. Thank you. Over to you, Narayan.
Okay, thank you, sir. One more question. I think this one could be to Dr. Mulyan. Something quite basic about the transmission. The question is, can you pick up COVID-19 from inanimate objects, and is there a difference in the transmission rate across different types of objects?
Okay, the beginning of the talk I said, I talk in terms of probabilities, not possibilities. Okay, you can conceive of all kinds of ways you can get it, but truly it's a droplet infection by and large. Okay, now if you are very unlucky, I suppose you can. But today, according to what we know, most infection come from person to person, droplet infection, and that's why distancing and mask works very well. But don't stop washing your hands, please.
Okay, anything else that the other experts on the panel would like to add?
Put it a very simple connotation. You touch something where somebody infected patient has spitted or coughed something, he touches, and after you put the knob, you open, and then you accidentally rub it on nose or something like that. Your chance, it has to go through, your respiratory pathogen. It has to go as respiratory pathogen. So you touch nose or eyes, there's every chance of going back again in a different way.
Narayan, is that there's a fair amount of misinformation and there is a lot of fear that has gone in, and in fact sometimes people have really gone overboard in terms of trying to protect themselves from a modality of transmission that doesn't even really exist. I think we've had people in overdrive, and you can't blame people. I think it's just the way information has been distributed and how they have been fed so much information, and some of it is incorrect, and I think that's where people have gone overboard. And I think, as Dr. J Prakash was saying, we need to actually get people to become a little more calmer about this, because I think the mind games here that we've seen over the last few months have really been quite devastating, really.
Another question, maybe Dr. Mulyan or others could take it. Since the cities are still under some version of lockdown, do you see a new spike when we fully reopen?
The dynamics of the transmission is such that R naught theoretically is calculated based on initial conditions. However, the R effective can be reduced by behavioral change. So the question is, will you come back to the original behavior? Will it go up? Now, the good thing about India, and I don't think any other country has the same status today, is that most of our reduction in transmission, wherever there are containment areas, is primarily because high levels of antibodies. So we are actually in a better shape than, for example, UK. I'm giving an example. Because there they behave well. So a kind of a recurrence is less likely to happen in India. Now, let me tell you one more thing about the recurrence. These bugs learn how to come back in cycles. There's something called cyclicity. Measles has a cyclicity of 3 years. German measles has a cyclicity of 7 years. I don't know what is it for COVID, but don't underestimate the guy. He'll come back, but not in a hurry. Okay, so our buildup of immunity from an epidemiological point of view caused a lot of death, I agree, but it makes us in a safe position. And with Ella's help in terms of vaccine, should be able to protect our population much further. Thank you.
Dr. Sibal or Dr. Ella, any comments?
No, I would.
I'm not. Sorry. Go ahead, Anbo.
Whatever, totally in agreement with what Dr. J Prakash has said. And sometimes, when you look back, you remember the days when swine flu broke out in Mexico City, and there were videos about it, and everybody said, oh my God, doom and gloom. Now, when you hear of somebody getting H1N1, do you bat an eyelid? You don't. So the fact that, COVID will disappear, the SARS-CoV-2 virus will just magically disappear is not going to happen. It's going to circulate. It's going to come back. It's just that our treatment, our vaccination, our whole approach will be different. We'll be more mature about it. And I think the public at large will not panic the next time we actually have to handle SARS-CoV-2 virus again.
Thank you. And the next question, to which I'm going to add my own, it asks whether the number of deaths in India is actually insignificant if you compare it to the number of deaths from other causes, and certainly even if you compare it to how fast it's increasing in and of itself. And therefore the question really is, should you be focusing on the number of cases, or should you actually, I suppose, take hope from the fact that the number of deaths or fatalities is low? But however, to that, I wanted to add a question on this issue of herd immunity, where the number of deaths actually can be quite high if the situation is unmanaged. So for herd immunity, we're looking at something at between 43 to 50% of the population getting infected or being infected. And even if you have a 1% fatality rate, that's 5 million or a bit less. That is still, the question then becomes political. Is it a politically kind of tolerable number of deaths to happen? So could any one of you, maybe Dr. Mulyan, you could start, clarify on the number of fatalities as the variable that we should be looking at. Does it matter or does it not? Can you explain?
What we can look at is the number of fatalities from Europe and adjust it for our age profile and ask the question, how many is expected to die if we were to experience the age-specific mortality of Europe? And that gives you certain numbers. We are finding less. And let me explain why that happens. We have 1/3 of the population in cities and 2/3 of the population in villages. Okay? In the deaths that we calculated for India, 90% should occur above the age of 60. Okay? And remaining below 60. Now, do you think the rural deaths from umpteen villages all across, a 70-year-old person dies of pneumonia, will ever be recorded? There's no way. So you don't have that in the horizon at all. Now, when I get worried is from cities, you get a proportion of deaths. And when I look at the deaths, a large proportion is below 60. I get worried. And the reason for that below is not because the young people are dying at larger number, it's because you are missing the older ones. And my feeling is this is because of a lockdown, difficulty to access 72-year-old man when he has breathlessness from a middle-class house. Number one. Number two, fear of quarantine, which existed. Okay, isolation, and the rest of the family get locked down. So what do you do? So these are the factors which will help, which will prevent. But we can, after the epidemic is over, assess how much was the excess risk. But I want to add one more issue on that. Your question had a very valid point. Can we afford herd immunity? That is the question. So people say herd immunity is not an option. But you know what? I agree it is not an option. But in our situation, it is inevitable. You are not asking for it. It is chasing you and reaching you. So what do you want to do? Go away herd immunity? I don't believe in herd immunity? That is ridiculous. It is there, sitting on your lap. So might as well say, okay, thank you, herd immunity.
Thank you. And
If I might
Dr.
come in,
yeah. Please,
so
please.
you made a very, very valid point about other conditions. You see, we have to realize that non-communicable diseases overtook communicable diseases in India a few years ago. So while we've been dealing with COVID-19, there are individuals who've had neurological problems. There are individuals with chronic renal failure who've been scared to come in and have their dialysis 3 times a week, and they've made it twice a week. We have individuals with diabetes whose sugar's gone off the good control they had. We have patients with oncology who've been worried and have delayed treatment. The gap between the chemotherapy cycles has extended. There are those where the diagnosis has been delayed. There are those who need a liver transplant and the chronic liver failure has progressed. So while we deal with COVID-19, we cannot lose sight of the larger health problems that we have. And I think as a clinician, as an administrator, I would want to give out this message that please do not ignore your health needs. I think there is a fear psychosis that has developed, and hospitals today are very well equipped in terms of their infection control protocols, in terms of how they look after their employees, their staff, how patients are treated when they walk in, how there is sanitization after procedures, how labs are run, how radiology functions, how the patients are admitted and procedures done. So I really want to make this appeal to everyone to not to ignore their healthcare needs, because when you delay treatment when it's needed, the outcomes actually become not as good as they would have been if you had actually availed of treatment at the right time.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ella, want to add a word?
I'll put it in a very logical way. This virus is intelligent. Our human system is also intelligent. We are fighting each other. So what happens is, if the virus is so intelligent over us, we should have wiped out the entire 1.3 billion population of Indians. They should have wiped out. It doesn't happen. So even flu, when a flu virus attacks in a shopping mall, even if somebody is a highly infected person, doesn't infect everybody. So there is a nature corrects it. That your genetic makeup of the person takes care of a lot of things. Why somebody gets a COVID, another fella gets a COVID, but one fella gets a lung infection, other lung problem, another one doesn't get it, asymptomatic. So I think our host immune system is a much more powerful that takes care of the nature. So we don't have to be really paranoid and, be so much paranoid such a way that, we get depression for other problems then I don't want that to happen. So I think we should just leave the nature. It will correct on its own. And you don't have to be that. Everybody will not die. Even if there are 10 members in the family, if one fellow gets it, all the 9 members will not die. So nature corrects it differently. So people have to be little sensible about that and not to be paranoid about it and still enjoy the life in a different way.
This is a question for Dr. Ella. I think you also touched upon it. How does shorter trial time, 30 days versus 6 months for rotavirus, translate into timing to determine if the vaccine is effective? That is, when likely will the results of phase 3 be announced, given the shorter trial time?
Our trial usually is a pandemic. We love to have 0, 1, and 6 months, span of clinical trial. It's a pandemic, so you really want to boost the system as fast as possible. You don't want to wait for 6 months to shoot the immune response. So we choose the method of 0 and 14, and everybody is doing the same thing actually globally, either 0-14 or 0-21. Everybody thought in initially single dose, but now it turned out to be 2 dose, seems to be inevitable. We're also working on a single dose concepts also with somebody else. But what is important is we need to choose the pandemic, how fast we shoot the immune response, that we find that 0 and 14 shooting the very good responses as we see that. So that's only reason. And that's why 30 days the clinical trial in one phase is over.
And again, Dr. Ella, any role of BCG MMR vaccine in this process?
I think Dr. J Prakash should answer that. But in general, we always have a notion in this country, Indians are resistant to all the diseases like that. We have mental syndrome in our place. Everybody, Indian, it's only American, Italians, Spanish people will get it. When it doesn't discriminate whether Italians or Indians, the virus doesn't discriminate that. But I think, what I see is In general, we might have exposed a lot of respiratory pathogens in the early stages. That might be the reason why we have little less mortality. Maybe Dr. J Prakash and Anupam should answer that question. I'm not a clinical guy, but what I see as a scientist, we have exposed so much of respiratory pathogen in the early stages of age in this country, with a lot of lack of sanitations and all that. So I think maybe that might be one of the reasons, but I don't know the other reasons. Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Narayan.
Dr. J Prakash, do you want to add anything?
Well, I am very fond of BCG for the simple reason that was my thesis for MD and also my thesis for doctorate. But the disease I was looking at was leprosy, a bacterial disease. But there ends the matter. I don't think that works really for this. If it works, it'll fine. At the moment, there is no evidence. So this business of MMR vaccine, had it been so, I wish it is true, because we recently finished giving all the Indian children below the age of 14 MMR vaccine. So we finished that work. Okay. Now, do you want to give MMR to a 60-year-old guy? I think I'll be cautious. Okay? And since we have a vaccine coming up, I think, and our mortality, like everybody is saying, it's not extremely high, okay? I am now 71 years old. There's a probability if I get a COVID, I will die. But I will tell you something. The probability I will not get a COVID, I will not die with COVID is 96%. Now that is pretty good for me, man. I mean, and instead of trying out this and that and a whole lot of stuff.
Fair point. A question for Dr. Sibal. Plasma convalescent therapy was advised as a treatment modality for moderate to severe cases, but the AIMS report, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, a report of yesterday mentions that there's no difference in the recovery between patients given plasma and patients not given plasma. Your take?
Like I said, what we know about plasma, conceptually very attractive, safe. What we need is a huge amount of data. We will get that because, when 20,000 plasma infusions have taken place in the US, let us look at those RCTs. Yes, we have one Indian paper, one Indian report already. There will be a few more in India, and let's see whether it is effective or not. And that's why whenever we've enrolled someone into this trial, we've said it's experimental, it's a trial. And no one has ever said that plasma therapy is a recognized therapeutic option. It is still experimental, as are the other agents that we are currently using. So I think we will, like I said, it's a very exciting area. We will get a lot of data very soon. And I personally feel that our whole approach to plasma therapy might just change. Maybe we need to use it very early. Maybe we don't need to use it at all. Maybe we need to use it in outpatients. So I think this is a space that's going to see some very exciting developments.
Quick question, Dr. Sibal. There was a lot of questions around ventilation, ventilator capacity. Have those been resolved now, do you feel, across the country? Is there a lot more ramping up to do because, or maybe can you rely on any other lower cost alternative technologies? Is that the way forward? Could you comment?
I think we've done pretty well in terms of ramping up capacity, whether it's in diagnostics, the scale of our diagnostic operations pan India, the hundreds of labs that have been approved by ICMR. If you look at PPEs from 0 N95s to actually now producing 550,000 PPEs every day. In terms of ventilation as well, we've had some indigenous ventilators developed. So I think we've done pretty well. I wouldn't worry about capacity. I really wouldn't worry about capacity. And we also now try very hard to avoid ventilation, like I said. So, perhaps in the early days, we were very worried about ventilation. Now we're not, because, we also have better tools. Our protocols are way better.
Okay. And a question to Dr. Ella. Basically, I spoke to Andrew Pollard of Oxford about their vaccine, which their results were out in the Lancet as well. And he was telling me about the possibility of mutation of the virus. He said that it's not a zero probability event, it can happen. So is that something that your vaccine will deal with? What is the technology of handling it if the virus, as you said, an intelligent entity in its own, starts to mutate in response to whatever factors are around it?
See, again, Dr. J Prakash should answer that, how the chances. But usually, this virus, two regions. One is a spike protein, and non-spike protein regions. The spike protein region, if it mutates, it's not advantage for the virus for its own survival. So, and what I've seen in the literature right now, there's only one mutation happened. Very randomly somewhere it's happened. One amino acid is being changed because one base changes in spike protein region. Remaining other region, lot of mutation is happening, but doesn't have any implication on the virus infectivity. So spike protein region is not much changing. Even if it changes, for example, a flu vaccine is a good example. A new virus, every time we plug in. So like an advantage of inactivated vaccine, if a new virus comes, just make it and produce that vaccine and start making it. Your regulatory system is safe. You may not have to do the clinical trial, but your manufacturing process is exactly same. Then you don't have to do clinical trial. You just go and plug in and play. I think so. We're well prepared for all those things.
As we draw this to a close, I just wanted to make one comment. And, while we talk about our battle, just want to pause for a moment and share with everyone that 200 Indian doctors have died fighting this war. And we really owe it to them that while we wait for therapy, while we wait for vaccine, social vaccination is in our hands. And I think the only way to pay homage to those who've made the supreme sacrifice is to make social vaccination a part of our life. And it's very simple. It's SMS, social distancing, masking, and sanitization with good hand washing. And I think we owe it to those who laid down their lives to remember this. This is in our hands. We don't have to wait for anyone.
Thank you, Dr. Sibal. And I do think, and I echo that, we should bear in mind, we don't often enough think of those on the front lines. Of course, the three of you yourselves are, in a sense, and I mean, all of your other colleagues, including, as Dr. Sibal said, healthcare workers who literally put themselves at risk every day. So we should remember that. We have time for maybe one last quick question with Dr. Mulyan, which I had, relating to testing. Now, testing is something that has also been sort of in the limelight right from the beginning. Are we looking at vastly wrong figures? Should we be ramping up testing even more? Or do you feel we're doing the right job and there's no need, and because this disease is anyway going to play out the same course that you've already laid out the parameters for?
The question of testing comes from what is the thing you're seeking out. Don't tell me somebody asked you to test and you're testing. You are testing for a particular purpose. That information should make some change in your mind. For a doctor to know whether it's at COVID or not helps, because the management lines are different for a COVID pneumonia from other pneumonia. It's so easy to know, that information is so vital. On the other hand, the amount of immunity in a population that come from IgG testing is helpful in terms of following the pandemic and the epidemic in the country, especially because that helps you to predict in terms of the remaining load of cases that we need to face. Now, like I said in the beginning, whether you like it or not, this herd immunity will come in and you will find it happening. And if it doesn't happen, I'll be very surprised. That's all I'll say. But that is one thing. But in terms of identifying now, for example, Chennai is teeming with the virus. Is there any reason for go on testing for the virus? No, I think you focus on taking care of patients. Okay? And that helps patient care. Why the guy who's asymptomatic and separate him? Because the virus is all over. So my way of looking at it, in a case where you're trying to eradicate the virus, like Kerala did, testing was so crucial so that you can identify everybody, contain the disease. But when you reach a state like Chennai or Delhi, forget it. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. You only ostracize people. You only increase the stigma, okay, and decrease the accessibility to healthcare for fear that you may be isolated or so on. So I think you have to use your judgment in different situation differently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we wrap up this presentation by our esteemed panelists. Stepping back, some of the key insights of this fascinating conversation touched upon everything as diverse as machine learning in therapeutics to the social psychological aspects of lockdowns to the incredible work being done by Indian vaccine developers on par with global competitors. And also, of course, as Dr. Sival poignantly mentioned, the fantastic work for which we should all be so grateful by doctors, healthcare workers across the sector, putting themselves at risk day after day. Of course, there is so much more to unpack from this highly informative session that we can digest at our leisure. But while we do that over the days to come, let us thank our three panelists. And with that, I will also hand back to CIC and to Vanita. Thank you.
I think that was a very interesting discussion. I think you managed to bring out all the questions that people have at this point in time. It was a very informative session, and we're already getting messages about the whole session. We also realize how busy you are. So special thanks for taking time out, this week and to work on the program specifics. Thank you so much, Narayan. And the panelists, we realize how busy this phase must be for you all. You're taking the time out for CIC means a lot to us. Thanks once again. And to all our wonderful audience who've joined today, thank you. We'll meet again soon. Thanks, Narayan.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. It was a fantastic program. Thank you so much.